Well, good evening, Councillor Titherington. Can I just check that you can hear us here in the Shield Room, please?
Yeah, I can hear you. Cheers.
Hello, Councillor Titherington, can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, thanks.
Okay, cheers.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending the meeting of the Standards Committee held on Thursday, 15th of September 2022. Before we proceed to business, I would like to hold a minute's silence as a mark of respect for our late monarch, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who sadly passed away on the 8th of September 2022. If you're able, could I ask you to stand, please? Thank you. And now proceed with the meeting. Welcome, everyone. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Councillor Carol Wooldridge, and I'm the chair of this meeting. Councillor Jackie Morse is the vice chair. Members of the committee are present here at the Civic Centre. Also present with me are our officers required to support the meeting. Other members of council present in the Civic Centre should please switch on their microphone to indicate if they wish to speak and to switch them off once they had finished speaking to avoid any feedback. Members who have dialed via Teams are asked to keep their microphone on mute. Please use the raise your hand function to indicate a request to speak and mute your microphone once you have finished speaking. Reports will be presented by officers and then debated in committee. Once committee has considered the report, I will then invite comments from other members present. Please note, this meeting is recorded and live streamed live on YouTube. The web link for this is displayed on the agenda for the meeting. I'll now move to the first item on the agenda. Any apologies for absence? So we have apologies from Councillor Chisholm, and Councillor Ogilvie is substituting for her. Item 2 on the agenda, declarations of interest. Does anyone have any interest to declare? Okay, thank you. Item 3, minutes of the last meeting. I have the minutes of the last meeting held on September 2021 for approval. Do we have a proposer and a seconder?
Just have one comment, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'll take those.
On page 5, we have submitted to council on the 22nd of September 2022. I think that should be 2021.
Okay,
Right down at the bottom in blue. Sorry about that.
Thank you for that, Councillor Mort. We'll get that amended. Okay, with that amendment, can I have a proposer, please?
I'm happy to propose that, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mort.
I'm happy to second that.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. So we have a proposer and a seconder. Are we all in agreement that we fit those minutes? Yeah, okay, thank you. And have they been approved? We've got those approved. Thank you. Item 4, minutes of the Code of Conduct Working Group. I have the minutes of the last meeting held on the 23rd of June 2022 for approval. Minutes of the group held on the 21st of April 2022, 4th of March 2022 and the 16th of December 2021 are also attached for information. I do have to say there's been a lot of work put into this working group, and I appreciate all the work that's been done by the members who are on the group, and including our independent persons as well as our officers. Thank you. So can I have a proposer and a seconder for those minutes, please?
Proposed, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mort.
I think I'm the only other person who can second it, so I will do so.
Thank you, Mr. Haley. Okay, is everybody in agreement with those minutes? Okay, those have been approved. Thank you. So move on to item 5, review of members' code of conduct. I'm going to ask Dave Whelan, our Deputy Monitoring Officer, to present the report. If I can hand over to you, Dave, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members are being asked to consider the proposed changes to the Code of Conduct and the investigations procedure. The intention is that we'll, if members are happy with the documents, that they'll be referred to full council next week. So there are 2 aspects to this, as I've already referred to. Firstly, the Code of Conduct. Now, last year, the Local Government Association issued a new model code for councillors. It reflected and incorporated recommendations that had been made by a number of bodies since the previous model code had been issued. Standards Committee met and resolved to establish a working group to include the independent persons to consider the new model code and to make any recommendations on a new form of code to be adopted. You will find the new proposed code at Appendix A in your papers. Members are now being asked to look at the code as a new document to assess whether it is fit for purpose. With regard to the extensive work by the working group chair that you've already referred to, we decided to keep changes to the model code to a minimum in an effort to ensure consistency across different local authorities. So that's the Code of Conduct. Now, the next piece of work relates to the new proposed investigations and hearings procedure. The working group also tasked the monitoring officer to review the investigation and hearing procedure and make proposals to Standards Committee, which would make the procedure simpler to follow, improve the speed of the investigations, and make it clear to members potential sanctions that can be imposed. Changes to the code itself, which will now include an obligation on members to cooperate with investigations, should assist in progressing matters, but simplifying the procedure was still considered essential. The proposed new procedure, Chair, is attached to Appendix B. The new proposed procedure reflects the existing three-stage process plus the public interest test at the outset and removes the initial contact with the member complained of. So the initial three-stage test that the monitoring officer will apply is the member currently a councillor? Was the member acting in that capacity when they were complained of? And if the allegation is true, is it a breach of the code of conduct? If this is applied on assessing the complaint, it is not necessary to speak to the subject member prior to any attempt at informal resolution or carrying out an investigation. The test referred to simply establish whether the conduct complained of is a breach at all. The public interest test which follows addresses whether it is in the public interest to investigate if the first three tests are satisfied. We may, for example, be dealing with a relatively minor complaint or a vexatious complaint. The next stage after the stage referred to, should it be decided that the conduct complained of was a breach and was serious enough, would be to consider a local resolution. This would require the agreement of the complainant and the subject member, but would be an agreed resolution, usually by way of an apology or something similar. More serious matters would be referred to for investigation. Now, these initial tests will be carried out by the monitoring officer, but it'll be the monitoring officer in conjunction with one of the independent persons. Now, the only thing I want to point out to you, Chair, is that in the final page of the hearings procedure, in paragraph 27, it says, on their return, the chair will announce the panel's decision in accordance with the council's assessment criteria, and the panel has the option to make any one of the following decisions on the complaint. It says no further action, but then the other actions don't contain an exhaustive list. So if you go to, I think it's page 42 of the papers, let me just get it up on my iPad. Yeah, if you go to page 42, on the left-hand column, you'll see the various actions that can be carried out. So I think my proposal would be we will copy that paragraph into paragraph 27, because that contains the full list of what the committee may do. Obviously, it may find there's no breach and no action is taken. But if a breach is found, that will clearly list those actions that are open to a standards hearing. As we know, those powers of sanction are limited, but that's prescribed by law, and there's nothing further we can do. But those are the powers which are open to us. So, as I say, Chair, the idea is if members are happy with this, we'll take this to full council next week and have it signed off and adopted. So, happy to deal with any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Whelan. Do I have any questions on either the code of conduct or the procedure? It's because I'm like
I think you had your hand up.
You're late, son.
Yes.
It's just a small query on page 28, and the second paragraph down that starts the Protection from Harassment Act 1997, and it says, defines harassment as conduct that causes alarm or distress or puts people in fear of violence and must involve such conduct on at least 2 occasions. I'm just a bit perplexed by that. Maybe you can explain to me why it has to be 2 occasions. If somebody misbehaves on 1 occasion, isn't that enough to instigate some kind of investigation or talking to?
Yes, I understand what you're saying. This is that wording is taken straight from the model code, so that's where that's taken, and the member is saying I will not bully or intimidate any person. I do not harass any person, and I promote equalities and do not unlawfully discriminate. Now, I suppose a one-off incident would probably come within the scope of 2.1. I mean, harassment normally suggests something continuing rather than just a one-off. That's not to say that the one-off incident can't be very serious or it shouldn't be looked into, but harassment normally implies continuing behaviour of some description.
Are you happy with that? Well, I know you're not happy with what it means, but you're happy with the explanation. Okay, thank you, Councillor Jones. Councillor Ogilvie.
Thank you, Chair. As I'm only a substitute on this committee, I'm coming in cold effectively, so I've got a number of questions which I think are really just clarification, to be honest, for me, but I feel that it's important that if I'm going to vote on this at the end of it, that I've got a clear understanding of what this document is actually saying. So please bear with me. I'm looking initially at page 21, paragraph 17, where it says a significant responsibility placed upon the monitoring officer, and the monitoring officer is mentioned throughout this document, but there's no mention of any deputy. Should the monitoring officer be off on prolonged illness, for example? The whole point behind this document, I thought, was to speed things up. So I think we need something in here that allocates a formal deputy to the monitoring officer. Page 23, Appendix A. Coming into this cold, I look at that document and I immediately assume that it is an exact copy of the LGA document, and we know that it's not. I know that it says on the first paragraph over the page that it does contain some amendments, but it doesn't indicate anywhere what those differences are. Perhaps just a suggestion that maybe on that front page that there's a comment at the bottom that says that there are some local South Ribble amendments to the formal LGA model rules, just for clarification. Because somebody else coming into this cold from outside may look at that and assume that that is the actual LGA model rules document, and of course we know it's not.
You want me to deal with questions as you go along, or?
Well, whichever you think's easiest. Yeah, probably best, because you might forget at the beginning by the time I'm finished. Sorry.
Yeah, in terms of the first point, what would happen in practice is, yes, the deputy would fill in for the monitoring officer. I've got no issues if you want to add a sentence somewhere to that effect. I mean, what you're referring to is the report. I don't think there's anything that needs changing in the code of conduct, but we could add a line to the investigation procedure. But that's certainly the that would be the expectation. In terms of your second point, there is something in the further down, I'm just trying to find the sentence where we do clearly refer to that. Yeah, it is a template which South Ribble has adopted with a number of local amendments. Now, I don't mind adding another sentence on that first page if you think that that's useful for clarity, or we can maybe cut and paste that sentence there and put that on the front page. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think probably it should be on the front page. So
yeah, I'll
I don't know
do
what
that.
everybody else thinks, but it's there clearly. So thank you for that, Councillor Ogilvie. The deputy monitor is actually mentioned on page 7. Oh, I don't know whether you want to put something in as please read deputy or monitoring or deputy monitoring throughout the document, so you don't have to keep changing it.
I'd have to find the appropriate place to include it, but obviously I have no problems with the issue if I can find an appropriate place for it. But it would be taken as read anyway, but I could see if I could add a sentence somewhere. Yeah.
I think we're trying to make this simpler and easier for members to read, so it might be a good idea to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for raising those.
Step to one. In such ways of challenge are limited. I'm not some challenge that only is something.
Sorry, Councillor Ogilvie, you haven't got your mic on. Is it?
Correct. Apologies. Yeah, I'm looking at page 31, paragraph 8.4. Second paragraph down, it mentions, albeit such rights of challenge are limited. Now, as I say, I'm coming into this cold, but where would somebody who was reading this document access what the appropriate rights of challenge actually are?
Yeah, the right to legal challenge, there's nowhere in the document that refers to that, but the right to legal challenge are very limited. There's no right of appeal as such, but what there is, and this applies to most decisions that a local authority makes, is there's always a theoretical right to, well, there is a right to ask for a judicial review of a decision, but that would only apply in exceptional circumstances. The other thing a member could do, it's not really a right to challenge as such, but they could seek to refer the matter to the Ombudsman. It's just a question whether the Ombudsman would want to consider it or not.
I mean, I'm just looking at it from the point of view of a councillor who's got a complaint against him. How does he find out what rights of challenge he's actually got? I think that's fundamentally important, quite frankly.
Well, I could add some words, albeit such rights of challenge are limited, such as judicial review, but the member would have to take their own legal advice on that because they'd be challenging the decision of the local authority. So it's not something that, if you like, the legal department or anyone could advise them on it. They'd have to seek their own legal advice. But I could say include reference to judicial review, but the member would have to seek their own legal advice. Yeah.
I'm just trying to get some clarification for people who may be involved in this process. That's all.
Yeah, sure. No, that's no problem. I can add something to that effect.
Page 39, similar comment to what I made before, Appendix B. In making a complaint, it must be made in writing again, specifically to the monitoring officer. In fact, not even to the monitoring officer, to a named monitoring officer. It's back to the issue of should there be a deputy there, but I think we've covered that already, as long as it's also applies now to the investigation and hearing procedure. That's all I'm saying there.
Yeah, council, what I could do is just include, or Chris, I could add just reference to in the absence of the monitoring officer, please contact myself and include my email address, just to make it abundantly clear.
And is there any impact, the sentence at the bottom there, the monitoring officer will acknowledge receipt of the complaint within 5 working days of receiving it? Is there any impact on the process if that is not done within 5 working days?
Well, there's no particular impact, but it's more just a question of, we don't want obviously complaints, people feeling that the complaint has been ignored or that it hasn't been acknowledged. All it's saying is that it will be acknowledged, so that the complainant has the comfort of knowing that someone is dealing with it.
Just on page 40, sort of the first half of the page, if you read it, the English isn't correct in a number of places. It's just in the interest of accuracy. I've no particular comment on the content. It's just there's some extra words stuck in here and there.
So what's the first half of page 40?
Yeah.
I'll try and read it.
I'm not sure if some of the ises should be ifs, but I'm not sure about that.
I'll have a double check tomorrow.
On page 41, investigation, the investigating officer will usually meet the complainant. What's the criteria for being an investigating officer? I know that it's the monitoring officer that appoints them, but on what criteria are they deemed to be appropriate?
We haven't had that many investigations. When we have had a few investigations recently, there've been legal officers that the monitoring officers instructed to carry out the investigation. Obviously, legal officers having a certain level of knowledge and understanding of these issues. Potentially, I mean, going back a number of years, probably 10 years or more, we did occasionally instruct people who are outside the council, wholly independent, and had experience in the field. But there's no set criteria as such. It's down to the discretion of the monitoring officer, and in practice, more often than not, he'd be looking to instruct a legal officer to carry out the investigation.
Okay, thanks for that. Bottom of page 41 under hearings panel. Hearings panel will consist of either the full standards committee or a subcommittee of that committee. So who determines whether it's a full committee or not a full committee, and on what basis?
On a practical level, that would be as a consequence of discussion between the monitoring officer and the chair of the committee. And in terms of what you take into account, I suppose it would be a level of seriousness, potentially, practicality issues. I mean, I could add a sentence in there saying that this decision will be arrived at by the monitoring officer in consultation with the chair of committee, if that helps. And it's whatever is considered appropriate for the particular complaint.
Well, I'm happy with that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Finally, you'll be glad to hear.
You always keep us on our toes, Councillor Ogilvie.
Page 46, the last page. Yes, it's just my understanding of this. The panel comes and makes a decision. The panel will be limited to sanctions, so they presumably recommend a sanction. And then going on to paragraph 27, am I right in assuming that, for example, take the second bullet point down, for example, that the matter be referred to the group leader for informal action? So does that mean that effectively the sanction, implementing the sanction, is actually the responsibility of the group leader?
I mean, that's
they could or could not accept the recommendation.
That is correct, Councillor. But that's the paragraph I referred to in my opening speech that I'm suggesting be amended. If you go back to page 42, there's a full list of the sanctions there in terms of it refers to publishing its findings, reporting to council, and then it does refer to recommended to a group leader or to the leader. But you're right, potentially the group leader or the leader could turn around and say, we're not going to implement it. I sincerely hope that wouldn't happen, but that's possible. In terms of what would happen then, that's a moot point. Maybe a report would have to be taken to full council, but you're right in what you're saying.
Yeah, it just seems that to go through all that effort to reach a decision, and then an individual could say, no. I'm just making the comment, that's all.
It's a perfectly valid comment.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. That's where I'll go there. I've got one of my own. Sorry, Mr. Whelan, because as we were going through that, I realised that there are some occasions where we need to be very careful. We're talking about him, and we need to be talking about either him, stroke her, or them. So I'm afraid that's going to have to be checked through. That's something we really can't be pulled up on. Because you will believe it, that if we don't do it before, that will certainly get pulled up on at full council. So,
this is actually in the code.
I spotted it. and I haven't even thought about it before because I've been looking at the content. I only spotted it when Councillor Ogilvie brought up on page 31, the bit that he brought up in the second paragraph, and it said a councillor would be expected to comply fully with the sanctions that have been imposed upon him. At the beginning of that paragraph, adverse finding against him. It may be the only place it's happened because I haven't checked that through, but
Yeah,
I think it needs.
I can do best to refer to them. I'd suggest most of the time. I'd probably best refer to them. I'd suggest most of the time, if it's, as long as that's correct English. I mean, in terms of a legal documentation, sometimes you refer to he, and the definition would be he would include she, etc. But I think for this document, fine, I'll refer to them if it's at all possible.
Thank you. I think we have to be very careful, actually, in this day and age now, and some people don't like to be called he or she. So I think probably them is the safer option. Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions from anybody? Yes, Mr. Haley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As yourself and Councillor Mort and I have seen the code in its various formats, it's certainly not for me to start raising questions about it because we've gone through that process. However, the investigation and hearing procedure, this revised format, has not been part of our deliberations at the working group, as you of course will be aware. Maybe other members may not have been. And I have 3 points that I've identified in going through and comparing this document, which we have here, with our current version. I fully accept what Mr. Moister and or Mr. Whelan, if both have been involved in this, it's somewhere in this report, it's making the point of trying to reduce the length of the procedure document, reduce the length of the procedure itself, and simplify it. And if you like, for that reason, there are 1 or 2 points which I might have mentioned, which I'm not going to, but I do think there are 3 issues which, at the very least, we ought to think about. I'm not necessarily saying we should amend the document, but I think they ought to be at least considered by ourselves. The first one arises out of the main change is that there's no requirement to notify the subject member at the initial stage. Now, the report does say that that's a deliberate change. And it's obviously something which the monitoring officer considers to be of some importance. But what I can't find in this document, and you know, by all means tell me if I've missed it, is at what point does the notification of the subject member take place? Because at some point, the subject member needs, obviously, to be told about the complaint, and the comments of that member are going to have to be sought. I could not find in this new document a point which it says where that's going to take place.
If I can help, Chair, it will. The proposal is it will take place if the complaint passes the initial test, and the monitoring officer would contact the councillor complained of with a discussion with regard to local resolution. Now, I would anticipate that if the member complained of came back with a full factual response, which called into question, you know, whether they had breached the code, then it may well be that the monitoring officer would have to review his decision as to whether local resolution was required. But that is, in terms of what's the proposal, that's when the member would be contacted.
Right. Does it actually advert to that in the document? Have I missed something, or is it?
Page 41, the investigation, second paragraph, first paragraph. The monitoring officer monitoring officer will appoint an investigating officer. The investigating officer will usually, you could argue, usually meet the complainant.
Thank you,
Somebody's
Councillor
probably
Ogilvie.
complained.
I'm actually thinking of the earlier stage before that,
Oh, you're right.
when the monitoring officer is effectively making the decision as to what to do, whether indeed to go to the investigating officer stage. I think it might be worth considering putting something in there which makes it clear at what point the monitoring officer does refer the matter to the subject member. I don't know if anyone else has any views on that.
Okay. Is that possible, Mr. Whelan? Could we?
Yes, Chair. I mean, and the point I'm very mindful of is that you've seen the code of conduct in various iterations, so any tweak should be relatively minor. Whereas this document is something new, so I could certainly look into that. I mean, the only practical issue is ideally we want to publish the report for council tomorrow. It's already in effect late, but if it's going to require a more rewrite, then it may have to go to a later council. But I don't suppose that's a great hardship. It's more important, I think, to get it right, isn't it?
Councillor Ogilvie.
Yeah, just to add to the comment I made about where it says something in the report about the subject member. Actually, the bit I referred to on page 41 under investigation refers to only the complainant, not the subject member. The first mention I can see of subject member is further down in the paragraph. At the end of their investigation, the investigating officer will produce a draft report and will send copies of that draft report to the complainant and to the subject member for comments. So that to me makes it sound like the investigation has actually taken place without the subject member ever having been contacted. Is that the intention?
I mean, no, obviously that would never happen. I mean, if you go back to page 14, formal resolution, it says in appropriate cases, the monitoring officer may seek to resolve the complaint informally without the need for investigation. Obviously, you can't carry out an investigation without at least giving the member the opportunity to put their version of events, but also the expectation would be that there'll be an attempt to resolve it informally. Again, that can only be done by agreement with the member complained of. But if members feel that it benefit from having a clearer statement about when the member complained of is first notified, then yes, we could add something to that effect.
Okay, is everybody happy for that? For that to go ahead. Okay.
Thank you. My second comment, Madam Chairman, arises from the point the procedure does allow for reference to a hearing panel after the conclusion of the investigation procedure. However, what is not mentioned in this new document is the initial assessment hearing panel. Now, this would, if it were there, it would go in as part of the section which says what the monitoring officer may do at the initial stage. Now, you yourself have indeed sat on one of these, and Mr. Whelan and I have as well, and we, I understood, found it was a useful mechanism for dealing with what one might call the more difficult or sensitive matters that possibly the monitoring officer felt needed a member input at an earlier stage. But that initial assessment hearing procedure is not in the new document.
I mean, through you, Chair, I mean, what David Haley is saying is correct. I mean, the report has been written on the basis that the initial assessment will be carried out by the monitoring officer in conjunction with the independent person, which is what happens at the moment for probably 95% of cases. But there have been exceptional cases where we've used an initial assessment panel. Now, if you want me to raise that with Chris Moyster with a view to reconsidering that, obviously I'm quite happy to do that.
I think perhaps we need to put that in as a possibility that this might have to take place. I'm in agreement with Mr. Haley that yes, we were called for, I think, 3 cases in 2019. Now, I don't know where that would have gone if it hadn't gone to the initial assessment, because it wasn't sort of, how can I put it, huge enough to go for a full hearing. So perhaps that does need to be considered. I'm in agreement with that. I don't know how everybody else feels about it. Anybody, any other comments? No.
Well, as I said, I certainly implied, if I didn't say in so many words, that I think that this is a useful element to be available if members feel and the monitoring officer feels that it's desirable. And it was certainly, I felt it was valuable on the occasions in which we were involved in those.
Thank you, Mr. Haley. Do you have any other comments?
One other. Now, what the previous version of the document had some comments about the necessity for confidentiality and possible anonymity if there was a request for anonymity by the complainant, and it also referred to the practice of disclosing the identity of the complainant to the subject matter, and the fact that the monitoring officer may, in certain circumstances, have to balance the criteria if the complainant wished to remain anonymous. Now, basically, my point is this: is it those who've gone completely? Would this committee feel that it would still be useful to have something in about these issues? I know. There's two separate points, really. The first is the question of confidentiality. Members shouldn't, if there's an investigation, members shouldn't start talking to the press. The second is if the complainant wished to remain anonymous, and how far that is to be balanced against the desirability, if not necessity, that the subject member is entitled to know who has made a complaint. And that's an issue that's in there. And the current version does address those aspects. The new version doesn't mention them at all.
I mean, through you, Chair, I mean, the intention when this document was written was to try and simplify it, shorten it. But if you consider these, it's better if some of those old provisions are back in this, then it's not an issue. I'll have to obviously speak to Chris about it, but there's no legal issue why you can't include those provisions again. So it's a matter for yourselves. The points obviously David making are perfectly reasonable, and it's just a matter for yourself whether you want those additional provisions in. As I say, Chris's intention was to try and simplify the document as much as possible.
Okay, does anybody else have any strong feelings about anonymity? From my point of view, I just feel it's a bit of a protection. So there is the availability, and members know that then.
The way the provisions work, it's a bit of a balancing exercise, because your normal starting point is that a member should know who's complained about them, but there may be exceptional circumstances where you take a different approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Yeah, those are the 3 points which I had. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Haley. Does anybody else have any more comments, questions? So I think it just remains for me to manage to get my iPad back on, for us to go back to the recommendations and vote on the recommendations for this. Sorry, just bear with me.
Yes, Chair, the recommendations obviously will have to be slightly tweaked, because it'll have to be in the light of the comments which have been made tonight by several councillors and Mr. Haley. I think the investigation hearing procedure may require a little bit more of a rewrite, so I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be available for council on Wednesday. The code of conduct, I think, will be a lot easier to do, but you're all very familiar with the code of conduct. Those have been on the working group, so the changes are relatively minor there. One of the main things I need to do is just reread through the whole document and just looking out for he's and she's and trying to use them wherever possible. Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Ogilvie.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering on the back of the fact that there's going to be a number of additions and amendments to this. Should it come back to standards when we've seen the amended version before we approve it to go to council? It just seems effectively what we were supposed to be doing tonight, so I don't see why it shouldn't be the same process for the amended, hopefully, final document.
It's a matter for you. I mean, the only thing I'd say is the code of conduct has been considered extensively. We're looking at relatively minor changes. The investigation and hearings procedure is a new document. It's your decision, but you may feel it's desirable to treat the two differently and say the code of conduct proceeds at council subject to the comments made, whereas the other documents will come back to you. Or you could say, well, no, we want to see both documents. Again, it's entirely a matter for yourselves.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Whelan. How does the committee feel about that? Would you be happy to take them as two separate documents?
Yes.
With the amendments? And we can take the code of conduct to council next week?
Yeah.
Okay, and then we'll, as Councillor Ogilvie suggested, we can look at the other one once that's been done. Right, so recommendations that the new code of conduct with amendments is recommended to council for approval. Are we all in agreement with that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll leave recommendations that the investigation and hearing procedure is considered again by the monitoring and deputy monitoring officer to bring to a further standards committee.
You could say something like, Chair, that the investigation and hearings procedure be amended in the light of the comments made at the meeting and be brought back to the next standards committee for approval, something along those lines.
Okay, thank you. I think that closes the meeting. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And I look forward to seeing you at our next standards meeting. Thank you.